Ayubowan everyone. Welcome to the Iron Bloods Institute. This is the third episode of the series Our Elites Just Suck. This is a series where we explain why our current elites suck and are so bad at doing their job. In part 1 of this series, we discussed the root cause of the Sri Lankan crisis, which was the usage of the neoliberal economic model by all regimes since 1977. In part 2 of this series, we looked into Sri Lanka's Western financial puppeteers and their willing local agents. Was it breathtaking incompetence and ignorance on the part of our current elites and leaders that led us to the current crisis in Sri Lanka? Or was it a malicious plot or conspiracy orchestrated by the efforts of a well-organized group against this nation? Is there a group working against the nations of the world to exacerbate hunger and want? In this video, we will do a deep dive into these topics and see what we can find. But first, a quick recap on what we found to be Sri Lanka's fundamental flaws in video 1. In the first video of this series, the root cause analysis we did showed us that these were the three main causes of the Sri Lankan crisis. In that, we proved that the neoliberal policies embraced by Sri Lanka since 1977 was the root cause of many of our problems. In this video, we will move on to the next one: gross incompetence, ignorance, and corruption of our elites, politicians, and senior government officials that led to actually implementing bad policies. Subsequently, it will become quite obvious that our elites were so focused on the game of politics and gaining power that they lost focus on the most important aspect of the state: actual good governance for the benefit of the population. In this video, let's try to understand if our elites just suck because they're incompetent, or if they truly are working against their own people. As per usual, let's jump straight in. This diagram shows us the weighted percentage of Sri Lanka's major imports in 2021. I use 2021 because it gives us a clear picture of Sri Lanka's major imports for the past 30 years since we embraced neoliberalism. Yes, this will be the same diagram I will use in the next video to cover the third and final reason for Sri Lanka's current economic crisis, our energy dependence. Nonetheless, for now, let us focus on the incompetence versus malice aspect of our governance. As you can see, energy-intensive products like iron, steel, fertilizer, and crude oil-based products like oils, plastics, and artificial rubbers account for more than 30% of Sri Lanka's total imports. Given this dependence and the drain on Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserve for these products, the logical and rational choice would have been to take steps to reduce these dependencies as much as possible. While Sri Lanka doesn't have its own crude oil reserves, our elites could have invested in thoroughly integrating Sri Lanka into the crude oil supply chain by heavy investments into refining and expanding Sri Lanka's refining capacity at refineries like Sapogaskanda. This is what Singapore did. Like Sri Lanka, Singapore too has no oil reserves whatsoever. Despite this, Singapore is today one of the world's biggest players in the petroleum industry, and that role has helped the country rise from poverty to first world wealth. If you are interested on exactly how Singapore did this, click here to watch this wonderful video by fellow YouTuber Asianometry that covers this topic in depth. The link will also be in the description. Doing this would have reduced the outflow of our foreign reserves by at least 20%, because we would not have needed to import these vital materials which many of Sri Lanka's local industries use as inputs. Despite this, none of Sri Lanka's regimes did enough to reduce Sri Lanka's dependence on these imports. In fact, our only refinery seems to spend more time closed than it is opened. What did the refinery plant say to the offshore drilling platform? Send crudes. The book called Alchemy of Ya by Thomas Hager should be the starting point for anyone looking into the beginnings of artificial nitrogen fertilizer. It has vivid details of the world-changing speech given by Sir William Crookes, inventor of the Crookes tube and president of the Academy of Sciences of the British Empire. It takes into account Sir Crookes' original speech and subsequent articles he wrote in 1899, 1900, and 1917. Arguing with his detractors. His remarks on the coming world famine achieved wide distribution in the press and were turned into a popular book. The book details the main aspects of his speech. He postulates that even England, with its vast wealth and imperial power, was at deadly peril. The truth of the matter was, as populations increased, land that can be used to grow wheat was limited. Further, centuries of farming had depleted the soil's natural nitrogen contents, and there would be an insufficient supply of wheat without adequate nitrogen in the soil. Yes, wheat is a very nitrogen-hungry crop. Sir Crookes and his audience viewed this as an existential threat to the British Empire and their political dominance, a fact that will become clear later. He predicted that humans would start dying of starvation in the 1930s. To prevent this threat to the power of Caucasians, Sir William Crookes called on chemists from the quote-unquote civilized world, meaning mainly Europe and the Americas, to find a solution to synthetically producing nitrogen fertilizer by the tons in factories. Sir William Crookes believed that Englishmen like him and his audience represented the pinnacle of civilization. He explained that both land, guano, and supplies of artificial French nitrogen fertilizer was running out. He drove home the point that if the British and the Caucasian race was to remain dominant in the world, they had to find a solution to this problem soon. News of the impending doom of the Caucasian race rippled out from Bristol throughout England, then to newspapers around the world. His words were read not only by scientists, but economists, politicians, intellectuals, and businessmen alike. The Germans took special interest in his call and began working on it, mainly because they did not have colonial possessions to fall back on. The book highlights the major events in the development of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer factories since Sir William Crookes' speech. After the Nitrate War in 1879, it was Sir Crookes that brought this topic to the forefront of the discussion of the intellectuals at that time. Wilhelm Ostwald was the first to answer Sir William Crookes' call to solve the nitrogen problem. BASF hired a young scientist named Haber Bosch to test Ostwald's claims. Later, he is put in charge of the project, and with the help of Fritz Haber's high-pressure arc process, they finalized the technology around 1910. A few more notable events include the fact that in 1915, the Kaiser's government funds BASF's second Haber Bosch plant. In 1919, the French gets access to the technology with a secret deal with Bosch. The British secretly bribed two German engineers that worked for BASF, and by 1923, they had two Haber Bosch ammonia plants. By 1924, the German central bankers had got inflation under control. With farmers buying fertilizer again, BASF entered a period of record profits. 2/3 of the income came from Bosch's ammonia plants. In 1936, about a third of the fixed nitrogen used by US farmers came from Haber Bosch plants. By 1960, it was 90%. Today, hundreds of huge Haber Bosch plants are drinking in air and turning out ammonia. All the plants run on the same principle Haber and Bosch pioneered but are larger and more efficient. Today, China is both the world's single largest producer and the world's largest consumer of synthetic fertilizer. The biggest Haber Bosch plant in the world today, located in Russia, produces about 2.5 million tons of ammonia every year. Without these plants, somewhere between 2 billion and 3 billion people, about 40% of the world's population, would starve to death. The process allowed population to boom in less developed countries if you see this graph. In fact, less developed countries benefited more from the Haber Bosch process than developed countries. The world population went from about 1.6 billion in 1890, when Crookes was predicting the end of civilization, to more than 8 billion today. This is in no small part to the Haber Bosch process and how it increased yields in crops. This would be the most important slide of this video. The technology for artificial nitrogen fertilizer has existed for more than 100 years. The knowledge of the importance of artificial nitrogen fertilizer was literally known for more than 130 years. So how could our elites, rulers and politicians not know? With all the given history and evidence available so freely to anyone on the internet about the sheer significance of nitrogen fixation to humanity's current development, using retroductive reasoning, there can be only 3 scenarios where our elites make this decision. Our elites are either appallingly incompetent and breathtakingly ignorant, in which case they do not deserve the power they've been granted. Or there are those amongst our elites who do know this and are working against the nations of the world to exacerbate hunger and want, in which case we are facing a situation of elite capture. This would be similar to when the Disaways of Sinhala decided to betray their sovereign, the king, the common people of the island, and align with the foreign invaders in 1815 to sign the Treaty of Kandy. My fellow Sri Lankans, while the common man was always loyal to our mother Lanka, it was always the elites that betrayed us. My fellow Sri Lankans, if the case is the latter, I am afraid we are in grave danger. Ignoring the most obvious and glaring expenditures, the previous regime led by Gotabaya Rajapaksa went after Sri Lanka's nitrogen fertilizer imports. Yes, our elites decided to ban fertilizer, which accounted for 0.79% of our import expenditure. Our elites ignored the 30% and focused on something less than 1%. They ignored 130 years of well-established knowledge of artificial nitrogen fertilizers. Fantastic, isn't it? How absolutely visionary. The regime at the time explained in Gazette Notification 2227/05 that the reason they banned import of fertilizer was to stop the depletion of our foreign currency. In this video, you can see the president of the time explaining the same thing. I will add the link to this video in the description as well. The Gazette number 2226/48 was issued banning fertilizer, as you can see on screen now. There are more videos in the description with the president explaining the reasons for this decision. My dear viewers, our planet has existed in its current form for over 4.5 billion years. I am not going to get into the arguments made by climate change extremists because that's not what this video is about. All I have to say is this. From the perspective of the planet, we are a passing fancy. Our lives are so short that it barely registers from the perspective of the planet. Mother Earth will be fine. So was this an isolated decision made by one Sri Lankan regime? Or was it an instance where the elites of Sri Lanka were following the lockstep of the global elites and ruling class? Let's zoom out a little and have a look at what's happening around the globe. This is the report put out by the Presidential Expert Committee of Sri Lanka during the previous administration. It details how Sri Lanka aims to follow SGD and UN 2030 agenda of reducing nitrogen-based fertilizers and moving on to an organic model. We already know what a disaster that has been for Sri Lanka. This is the Fit for 55 policy platform brochure pushed by the EU on its members. This brochure is called Transforming Food Systems for Farmers by the World Economic Forum. Pay attention to the recommendations. The USA too seems to have joined in on the efforts, as this article mentions. Dutch farmers are protesting heavily against these regulations that their government has imposed. The people of Belgium and Germany, too, are putting pressure against the stifling green regulations of their governments. Farmers in Spain, Italy and Poland, too, are joining hands with their peers in the rest of the EU. Remember, we already discussed how the intellectuals of the world in the late 1800s established nitrogen fixation as a core tenet, a fundamental pillar of their power and influence. Human civilization has known this for nigh on 130 years. If that is the case, dear viewer, why are many of the governments around the world, especially those influenced heavily by the West and Western ideas like Sri Lanka, suddenly ignorant of the significance of artificial nitrogen fertilizer? Or is there a coordinated push to persuade entire nations into starving themselves out of guilt towards Mother Earth and false ideology? That, dear viewer, is up to you to decide. If you do decide that the answer is the latter and want to do something about it, you can start by screenshotting this meme and sharing it with your friends and enemies alike. Yes, the meme is in crude humor and has a shock factor. This is intentional. The point is to start a conversation. The most powerful social media is not Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or WeChat. It is the word of mouth of common people. The internet is merely a tool to make that happen faster. There are links in the description with 2 versions of this meme as well. Use them as you see fit. That's the end of the 3rd episode of the series, Our Elites Just Suck. In our next episode, we are going to discuss the final reason for Sri Lanka's crisis and present solutions for it beyond the illiterate chanting of IMF, IMF, IMF mantra that our current politicians and elites seem to be doing. If you found it informative, please like and subscribe to make the algorithm gods happy. Share this video with your friends and leave me a comment if I've made any errors or if you want to say hi. Thanks for watching.